class, in this video we're going to talk about blood, okay, and components of blood. So if we remember from histology, blood is a matrix, so it's considered a type of connective tissue, okay? So it is made up of cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. There are proteins in there as well, and that is surrounded by a liquid matrix known as plasma. So if we were to centrifuge our blood, which means if we got a vial of our blood and put it in a test tube and we were to spin it around really, really fast, it would separate out by density. So if we have our test tube of blood here, okay, about 45% of it would be red blood cells. Red blood cells, okay. About 1%, a very small percentage, would be made up of white blood cells and platelets. Okay, and then 55% of it would be made up of plasma. Okay, so let's go through those different components. So if you were to get blood work taken in a typical CBC, they usually test for hematocrit. And hematocrit is just the percentage of red blood cells that you have, okay? So you're looking for somewhere around 45%. It differs in the genders as well, okay? So normal value for males is about 47% plus or minus 5%, and for females it's about 42% plus or minus 5%, okay? Okay, so we're measuring about this 45% of our red blood cells. Okay, so blood is a sticky type fluid. It has a metallic taste to it because of iron. Okay, pH is about 7.35 to 7.45, so you usually say 7.4 on average. Okay, it makes up about 8% of our body weight, 5 to 6 liters in male, 4 to 5 liters in females, okay? All right, so plasma portion of blood, we have water. There's also proteins in here that help with clotting and other things, and some other solutes as well found in the plasma. Here in our Buffy coat, we have white blood cells and platelets, and then down here we have our red blood cells. So these three are the formed elements of blood. That's how they're referred to as, because they're, actual elements instead of just fluid, okay? So the only cells here that are complete cells are our white blood cells, okay? So they have nuclei and organelles. Platelets are fragments of cells, okay? So fragments of megakaryocytes that fall off or break apart, okay? So no nucleus, they're really just pieces of cells, they're not full cells. Red blood cells do not have organelles or nuclei because they want to make room for heme groups to hold on to iron and oxygen, okay? So red blood cells are not considered full cells because they don't have a nucleus or organelles, okay? Most of these formed elements only are found in the bloodstream for a few days. Okay, and then more are constantly being made, typically in the bone marrow. We'll go through all of that, okay? So our plasma, about 7% of our plasma is going to be made up of proteins, and we'll go through those proteins. You do need to know the functions of those different proteins. So we have albumin, globulins, fibrinogen, and then some other smaller or not as important proteins, okay? And about 92% of our plasma is going to just be made up of water. Okay, and then red blood cells are just red blood cells, okay? Platelets are just those little pieces of cells, and then white blood cells, we have neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So those are all the different types of white blood cells that we're going to talk about. Okay, so if you see a blood smear, you'll see mostly red blood cells throughout. You'll see next you'll see lots of platelets as well, and then you'll see a few white blood cells spread out throughout the blood smear. Okay, so what are the general functions of blood? So blood, of course, transports oxygen to our tissues and takes carbon dioxide waste back to the lungs to be expelled, okay? And the red blood cells are responsible for that. It also helps to regulate homeostasis of our body fluids, pH, body temperature, and water content within our cells, okay? And then it protects against loss of blood by clotting, okay? So platelets and the proteins found in the plasma are used for clotting blood when we have injured one of our blood vessels, okay? Also, our white blood cells within the blood function to help protect us with our immune system, okay? Okay, so our lymphocytes, these cells, remember I said most of these cells only are alive for a few days. One exception is lymphocytes. They're able to live for years, okay? Unlike most of the other cells like red blood cells, platelets, etc., only are around for a few days, okay? And they're constantly being remade, okay? But lymphocytes are really important in our immune system, so we need them to be around for a while. Okay, they have memory, okay? So red blood cells and platelet numbers stay around the same. They're not really going to change too much as they die off. New ones are being formed, okay? So that process of producing blood cells, so white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells is known as hemopoiesis, also referred to as hematopoiesis. Either way is fine, okay? So we have pluripotent stem cells, which are stem cells that can differentiate into different types of cells, and they differentiate into each type of blood cell. Okay, so I have another video posted on Blackboard through YouTube where I go through all of these different cells being made, hemopoiesis. Okay, so make sure you watch that. I'm not going to go into detail on that here since I already have that other video where I go into a lot of detail, okay? So make sure you watch that. Okay, so red blood cells, let's talk about red blood cells in a bit more detail. Red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, they have a protein known as hemoglobin, okay? And hemoglobin is what carries oxygen to cells, and it carries some of the carbon dioxide back to the lungs. Okay, so each hemoglobin molecule contains an iron ion, okay, and this allows the molecule to bind to 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, so each hemoglobin can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, and again, those red blood cells do not have a nucleus or other organelles, so they are known as biconcave. I'm gonna try to draw as best as I can. This is kind of like a red blood cell, and what I'm drawing here with this circle, it's not like an actual other circle, is there's an indentation on either side of the red blood cell. So it kind of pinches in on the top and on the bottom. Okay, so it's known as a biconcave disc. And this just allows, the biconcave disc shape allows more space to carry oxygen on that red blood cell. Okay, so red blood cells are very efficient at carrying oxygen, or just for gas transport in general, because carbon dioxide as well. So one is that biconcave shape that I just talked about. It offers a very large surface area relative to the cell's volume. Okay, and that large surface area so that we can carry more oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, hemoglobin makes up 97% of the cell's volume besides water. Okay, so hemoglobin is what carries that oxygen. So having that large space for hemoglobin makes red blood cells efficient for gas transport. And red blood cells do not have mitochondria. So remember we said they don't have all the organelles, they don't have mitochondria. Okay, so the way that they produce ATP, they do still produce ATP, but they do it anaerobically, so without oxygen. So they don't consume any of the oxygen that they transport. So that makes them even more efficient. So hemoglobin binds with oxygen and it's going to bind reversibly. That means that it can let go of the oxygen pretty easily as well. Okay, so hemoglobin binds reversibly with oxygen. So hemoglobin has a red heme pigment and it's bound to a protein known as globin. Okay, globin has 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. Okay, and those are just how proteins are arranged. Okay, there's alpha and beta chains in proteins. And a heme pigment is going to be bonded to each of the globin chains. Okay, and this is what gives, the heme pigment is what gives blood its red color. Okay, and then each of the heme groups, there are 4, each of them have a central iron atom that binds an oxygen molecule. Okay, so hemoglobin helps to regulate blood flow and blood pressure by releasing nitric oxide. Remember we talked about this briefly in endocrine system. Okay, so nitric oxide causes vasodilation, so blood vessels to open up. Okay, and this improves blood flow and enhances delivery of oxygen. If blood is flowing well, then the oxygen can be delivered to our tissues very easily. Okay, red blood cells also have carbonic anhydrase. This is an enzyme, right? Anything that ends in ASE is an enzyme. And it catalyzes the conversion of carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then transports most of our carbon dioxide. So carbonic acid transports around 70% of the carbon dioxide within our plasma. Okay, so only some of it is carried through hemoglobin. A lot of it is within the plasma and carried by carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so red blood cells only live for about 120 days, so about 4 months. Okay, and the dead red blood cells are going to be removed from our blood circulation by the spleen and by the liver. Okay, and then those breakdown products of the red blood cell are going to be recycled and reused. So the heme groups, globin, all of those are going to be reused. Okay. Okay, so oxygen is loaded up through the lungs, so through the alveoli. We'll talk about that more in respiratory system. And it goes into our circulation. So it binds to hemoglobin. Once it binds to hemoglobin, it's known as oxyhemoglobin. And it's this like ruby red color, like this bright red color. Okay. Then oxygen is unloaded in the tissues. When it's unloaded, it produces deoxyhemoglobin. Okay, so this is like reduced hemoglobin. It's not carrying as much of its oxygen anymore. Okay, and in this case, our blood is going to be a darker red color. Okay, and then carbon dioxide is loaded up in our tissues and then brought to the lungs to be expelled. Okay, 20% of that carbon dioxide in the blood is going to bind hemoglobin, and this produces carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, so when hemoglobin is bound to oxygen, it's oxyhemoglobin. When it has released its oxygen, it's deoxyhemoglobin, and when it's bound to carbon dioxide, it's known as carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, back to hematopoiesis. So again, this is how all of our blood cells are formed. So white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells, all of our formed elements. And this happens in the red bone marrow. Okay, and it starts with our hemopoietic stem cells, okay? And those stem cells give rise to all of our formed elements of blood there, okay? So in that other video, I talk about hemopoiesis, including how red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets are formed. So I'm going to skip over that here. You can see it in that video, okay? Okay, let's talk about red blood cell breakdown. I don't remember if I talk about it in the video, so if it's repetitive, sorry about that. Okay, so red blood cells don't have a nucleus, right? We talked about that. So they can't make new proteins, they can't grow, and they can't divide. Okay, so old red blood cells will become fragile, hemoglobin will degenerate, so it'll just kind of fall apart. Okay, and they can get trapped in small circulatory channels like in the spleen. So macrophages will come in, these large cells, and they break down the red blood cells that are dying. Okay, the liver also will help to remove red blood cells during circulation. Okay, so when red blood cells are being broken down, heme, iron, and globin are all separated from each other. Okay, iron is then going to bind to ferritin and will be stored for reuse later. Heme will be degraded to the yellow pigment bilirubin. Okay, so the liver secretes bilirubin in the bile, or from bile into the intestines, and then it's further degraded to urobilinogen. Okay, and that is then turned into stercobilin, which is a brown pigment, and that leaves the body in feces. So that's why feces are that brown color. And then globin is metabolized into amino acids. So remember, amino acids make up proteins. So it's kind of cut up back into the amino acids, and those amino acids can then be reused. Okay, now let's talk about white blood cells. So white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, they have a nucleus and organelles, but they don't have hemoglobin like red blood cells. Okay, so it could be granular or agranular. Granular white blood cells have vesicles, and you could see those granules when the cell is stained, so under the microscope. Okay, so the granular leukocytes are, here, let's kind of write this out and separate it. So granular leukocytes, remember we're talking about white blood cells. Okay, and then we have agranular, meaning they don't have granules. Okay, so our granular leukocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Okay. Our agranular leukocytes, so they do not contain any granules, are lymphocytes and monocytes. Okay, so lymphocytes and monocytes. Okay, so we'll talk about all of these. So let's try to draw these out. We'll use a different color. So neutrophils have a multi-lobed nucleus. It's usually 3 to 5 lobes. Okay, and these are granular, so you see the little granules on them. So here's our neutrophil. Okay, and it has this nucleus that has multiple lobes to it, so it'll look something like this. Okay, and these are going to be a darker color. It's not stained black, I'm just drawing it in this color. It'll be pink around and then purple where the nucleus is, and then you'll see the granules throughout, so all these little dots throughout this cell. Okay, those are the granules. Okay, so that's a neutrophil. Eosinophil. Okay, for eosinophil, the nucleus has 2 lobes to it, so it kind of looks like aviator glasses. So something like this. This is usually a bit thinner in the center there. Okay, so something like that. That's an eosinophil. This is also a granular leukocyte, so there will be granules everywhere. Okay. Basophils. Basophils do have a nucleus. But you can't see it because the granules obscure it. So it has lots of granules here in basophils. So many that it covers nucleus. Okay, so you'll see a better picture of it when you look at them under the microscope or if you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so there's a basophil there. Okay, our leukocytes, oh, I put lymphocytes. Yes, sorry, lymphocytes. Okay, so our lymphocytes have such a large nucleus and very little cytoplasm. So the nucleus would take up like all of this space and it would be stained like a dark purple color, and then you'll see like a little bit of a lighter purple everywhere else. So pretend like this is all colored in here. But the nucleus is just so large it takes up almost the entire cell. Okay, so that's a lymphocyte. And then monocytes, draw it down here. That's our other agranular leukocyte. And they have a nucleus that's kind of shaped like a kidney or like a bean. So something like that. And then it'll be stained darker within this bean area. Okay? So those are what all of our white blood cells look like under the microscope. Okay, so main function of our white blood cells is to combat any invading microbes. Okay, anything foreign, to take care of it in the body. Okay, so when there's some sort of invasion of something in the body, white blood cells can leave the bloodstream and collect where we have any sort of site of invasion, so any microbes, viruses, etc. Okay, this is known as emigration. They'll stick to the side of the blood vessel and then squeeze out through the epithelial cells. Okay, so white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, these are, again, the only formed element that is a complete cell with nuclei and organelles, but they make up less than 1% of the total blood volume. Okay, so neutrophils make up about 50 to 70%, so these are easiest to find under the microscope. You can try to look for all these different types in lab. Okay, eosinophils make up 2 to 4%, so these ones are hard to find. Basophils even harder to find, about 0.5% to 1% of white blood cells. Lymphocytes are 25 to 45% of white blood cells, and monocytes are 3 to 8%. Okay, so it's easy to find neutrophils and lymphocytes, but a bit harder to find the rest of those. Okay, leukopoiesis, again, I talked about that in that other video going over hemopoiesis. Okay, so make sure you watch that video. Same thing with thrombopoiesis. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the functions of these white blood cells. Okay, so, let's start with our monocytes here. Okay, so these can go in tissues and they become macrophages, which are large cells that break things up. Okay, so they phagocytose things, again, eat things up. Okay, and they can present antigens to T cells. So they can say, here, I found this for you, right? And show that antigen, which is a protein embedded into something, so like a virus or a bacteria, okay? And it tells the T cell to fight it off, okay? Basophils here. That's the smallest percentage of white blood cells we have. About 1% of our white blood cells are basophils, okay? The granules in our basophils have what's known as heparin and histamines, and they increase inflammation, okay? So basophils are for inflammatory responses. Eosinophils here, their granules secrete toxic proteins, okay? So they secrete cationic peptides, and a protein known as major basic protein. I know it's a weird name, but that's what it's called. And they kill parasites. So if you had some sort of parasite then your eosinophils would go and try to fight that off. Okay, and they also play a role in our allergies, so type 1 hypersensitivities, which are allergies. Okay, neutrophils, these are phagocytes as well, so they eat substances up. And they can also turn oxygen into superoxide, which can turn into hydrogen peroxide. Okay, and then into a hydroxide radical, which is very dangerous. So radicals want to bind with everything. Okay, so they can tear things up very easily. Okay, or they can turn into hypochlorous acid. Okay, so this can damage DNA, proteins, and membranes. So it can damage the DNA of any sort of foreign invader in the body. Okay, so it's known as an oxidative burst because it has to do with oxygen. So it can kill a difficult bacteria, but it will also end up killing itself because it is so toxic. Okay. They can also release extracellular traps, so they can release their own DNA to tag material for destruction. Okay, so put a little like sticker on it almost, right, and say this needs to be destroyed. Okay. Platelets are fragments of cells. They help plug blood vessels to prevent blood loss. And I have a separate video talking about hemostasis as well, which is blood clotting, where I talk about platelets and all those different proteins from the plasma that help with hemostasis or blood clotting. Okay, so make sure you watch that. And then lymphocytes. We have B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. B lymphocytes can turn into plasma cells and they can secrete antibodies. Okay, so remember I talked about antigens. Okay, so antigens are things on cells. So say we have like a bacteria cell. An antigen is something here, let's say it has a little triangle. Okay, it's just a protein embedded within the cell membrane. Okay, so this here is a bacteria, bad bacteria. Okay, this here is an antigen. This is going to be important. It's one word, but I couldn't fit. Okay. So this is going to be important when we talk about blood typing. So you need to know what an antigen is and an antibody. Okay. B cells can create antibodies that can bind to these antigens and destroy them. Okay. So B lymphocytes, very, very important for our immune system. We'll talk a lot more about them when we get to lymphatic system as well, immune system. T lymphocytes, there are two types, T helper cells. These help the B lymphocytes turn into plasma cells. Okay, and those are the type that secrete the antibodies. And cytotoxic T cells. So cytotoxic means toxic to cells. These will induce apoptosis of a virus or a cancer cell. Okay, so T cells are also, our lymphocytes are very, very important for our immune system. All of our white blood cells are very important, okay? Okay. So if we have an elevation in any of our white blood cells, it indicates that there's something going on in the body. Maybe some sort of infection, some sort of inflammation, maybe a parasitic infection, right? If you have a low white blood cell count, this can develop due to different causes, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so a differential white blood cell count, when you get blood work, helps to determine that if there's an increase or a decrease in any of the leukocytes. Okay, so neutrophils, if we have a high count, it can indicate a bacterial infection, stress, or inflammation. Low count can be due to vitamin B12 deficiency, a few things here. Okay, we're going to talk about this very quickly. I don't really ask about it in the lecture exam, but I want you to know what it could potentially mean. Lymphocytes, high lymphocyte can mean a viral infection or maybe a leukemia. And low count can indicate some sort of prolonged illness that's using up these lymphocytes, maybe an HIV infection or some sort of immunosuppression. Monocytes, an increased count can indicate a viral infection like most of these, right? Tuberculosis, okay, or some other sort of chronic disease. Low count can indicate suppression of bone marrow where they're made, okay? Eosinophils, right here can indicate an allergic reaction or a parasitic infection, okay? Low count can be an acute allergic reaction, so some short-term allergic reaction where they're being used up. And then basophils, a high count can indicate an allergic reaction or maybe some sort of cancer, and a low count can indicate pregnancy, ovulation, or hypothyroidism. Okay, hemostasis is next. Again, I have a separate video talking about hemostasis, so I am going to skip over that. Make sure you watch that video, okay? Go into a lot of detail there. Okay, blood groups and blood typing. Again, I have another video on blood typing and blood types, so make sure you do watch that. Okay, we'll go over it in lab as well because you're gonna do a blood typing kit in lab with fake blood, but you're going to do it. It's pretty fun and interesting, but make sure you do watch that blood typing video before coming to lab to do the blood lab, okay, so you have an understanding. And again, if you have questions, we're gonna go over it again in lab. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through all of that. Okay, so some disorders of blood we have, we're just gonna talk about a couple. So sickle cell disease, this is a genetic type of anemia. So the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is reduced, okay? So the red blood cells of people with sickle cell have a different type of hemoglobin known as hemoglobin S. And this causes the red blood cells to bend into a sickle type of shape, okay? So the red blood cells, instead of being their normal biconcave disc, are this like sickle shape, and they tend to stick to, other red blood cells stick to the walls of blood vessels, and it causes clotting, okay? So sickle cell is very, very dangerous, very painful disease. Okay, some other blood disorders, polycythemia vera. This is where the red bone marrow makes too many red blood cells, so the blood thickens up because there's not as much plasma, right, if there's too many blood cells, and this can slow down blood flow, and this could cause clotting, the cells won't get enough oxygen, etc. Microcytic anemia, this is where red blood cells don't have enough hemoglobin, so they're smaller than normal. Normocytic anemia, this is where there's not enough red blood cells for the body's needs, so the body's cells would not get enough oxygen. Macrocytic anemia, this is where the bone marrow makes red blood cells larger than normal, and of course this can cause issue because they won't flow as well. They won't be able to leave the cell as easily either to bring oxygen to our tissues. Okay, cancers, so we have leukemia and lymphoma. Leukemia is a white blood cell cancer found in the blood. So this can affect either the lymphoid line or the myeloid line. And again, I talked about that in the other video, so make sure, hopefully you've watched that. Okay. So the cancer accumulates in the bone marrow and it crowds out the bone marrow. So less healthy blood cells are made and more cancer cells are made in leukemia. Okay. So it stays in the blood, it doesn't travel to the lymph nodes. And the white blood cell count goes up in leukemia, okay? So, but it's those bad white blood cells, so infection still increases. Lymphoma, this is a cancer of the lymphocytes, so this will be found in lymph nodes. This happens only in the lymphoid line, so for T and B cells, right, are lymphocytes. So the B cells will be made and mature in the bone marrow, okay? T cells mature in the thymus, and then they both wait in lymph nodes to be until they're needed, okay? So the cancer is found within the lymph nodes where those mature T and B cells are waiting. Okay, so let's talk about bone marrow transplants. Bone marrow transplants are used to replace cancerous red bone marrow with normal red bone marrow in people with cancer. So the donor's marrow is usually collected from the iliac crest of the hip bone. So remember when we talked about bones? We talked about how most of the red bone marrow is found in those flat bones. Okay, so the iliac crest would be a great area to take red bone marrow from. Okay. Stem cells can also be collected from the umbilical cord after birth. So those can be used, and it's easier to use those to make normal red bone marrow or make normal red blood cells. Okay, or normal white blood cells as well. Okay, but this is very expensive. So you can get your cord blood saved, but it's very, very expensive. So I don't think very many people do it, even though it could potentially save someone's life if they were to get those cancers.